Hi, my name is Chris Wiggins. I'm a member of the League of Women Voters of Oakland area, and I'm here to share with you some information that our league has put together on nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting. We're not experts, this is just the information that we've found, and I'm also not an expert presenter, which I hope to not make evident too many times during the course of this, but if I do, just hope you'll forgive my faux pas. Our agenda is as follows. What's the problem? What are nonpartisan primaries and ranked choice voting? How do they solve the problems? How do they relate to our LWV mission? And what's next? So, what's the problem? Kids saying to the teacher, that's why no one likes math. It's a branding issue. Everything's a problem, which is about how I feel about our election system right now. Everything is a problem. Some of the problems with our current voting system are, number one, there's a substantial risk that the winner is someone that the majority actually opposes. The legislature is dysfunctional. Safe districts disenfranchise a large percentage of voters. Less than 10% of Michigan voters select more than 70% of our House and Senate. Partisan primaries eliminate candidates that the majority of the people want and nominate candidates towards the ends of the ideological spectrum who don't work well together. This is clearly not a list of all problems, but these are the ones we're going to talk about today. So the first problem, substantial risk that the winner is someone that the majority does not want. Michigan, like almost all states, uses a plurality system to determine winners. And the plurality is what if you get more votes than any other candidate, you win. So if you only got two candidates, yeah, that winner is going to have a majority. As soon as you go to three candidates, there's a possibility that the person might win with less than 50% of the vote. So in this very extreme example I created here, three candidates, Alpha 34, 33, 33, Alpha wins with 34% of the vote. This problem is not imaginary, it's real. It's happening in Michigan. Here's some Michigan examples. So in East Point, Michigan in 2019, there were five candidates for mayor. The winner had 32% and was a whopping 19 votes ahead of the second place finisher. In our 2024 primaries for the state house, Republican primaries for districts 13, 50, and 64 were won by 38%, 33%, and 30%. Well, if the plurality winner were always the same person who would win a runoff or whatever, no harm, no foul. But the problem is that's not true. There's been a lot of study done of US presidential elections, and it shows that 7 of our elections have produced a result that the majority did not want. And if there's 5 of them, it's absolutely clear. And the most recent example of that would be our 2000 election. If you look at the state of Florida, George Bush had 48.84, Gore had 48.3, Ralph Nader had 1.64. Well, it's clear that Ralph Nader's supporters, the consumer-friendly, environmental-friendly folks, did not want George Bush. But if you take Al Gore and Ralph Nader and put them together, you've got a majority. Similarly, in New Hampshire, Gore plus Nader would have been a majority of the voters in those states. And if Gore had won either of these states, he would have won the election. We have two presidential elections where a spoiler probably influenced the result to something the majority did not want. The most recent example of that would be the election of George Bush versus Clinton versus Perot, where Perot sucked off a large number of votes. The tendency is that most of them probably would have gone to George Bush. Problem. Our legislature is dysfunctional. Now, it's not a new problem. I'm going to read this quote from Will Rogers. Tax relief, farm relief, flood relief, dam relief. None of these have been settled, but they are getting them in shape for consideration at the next session of Congress with the hope that those needing relief will perhaps have conveniently died in the meantime. So the problem's not new, but I think it's gotten worse. A University of Maryland study done in 2021 found that majorities of Democrats, majorities of Republicans, and majorities overall had substantial agreement on over 150 policies for the national government. And the policies covered things ranging from immigration, national defense, taxation, budgeting, Medicare, whole, whole spiel. Let's look at the immigration policies. So they found that requiring employers to use E-Verify to make sure that a person is a citizen before they hire them for a job. Well, Democrats support that by 68, Republicans support it by 80, and the overall support 73%. Give DACA persons a path to citizenship. 92% of Democrats, 69% of Republicans, 80% overall. Increase the number of visas for low-skilled workers. 87%, 66%, 77%. Hire more workers to process the claims of asylum seekers. 96, 90, and 93%. So extremely broad agreement on some policy recommendations. Some of these proposals, these first three, might look very familiar to you. And the reason is that those three were all part of a proposal that was introduced by Ted Kennedy and John McCain in 2005 as part of their Comprehensive Immigration Reform Act. The last one wasn't included because in 2005, there were a historical low of asylum seekers of 30,000 compared to the almost 1 million that we had in 2023. So I didn't cover that because it wasn't a problem. But the problems that did exist, they had. And they've been there ever since. And for 20 years, our Congress has done nothing. Their job is to enact laws that reflect the will of the people. And when you have that type of overwhelming majority, they should be doing it. And they're simply failing. Our Congress is broken. The next problem, safe districts give a few voters greatly disproportionate power. And here you have Iowa standing in front of the other states on the primary choices saying, no need to push, I'm ordering for all of you. Well, that's kind of what's going on here. So let's talk about safe seats. Nationally or in Michigan, most seats are safe for either the Democrats or Republicans. Now, by safe, I mean that there's at least a 55 to 45 advantage. So if you look at Michigan House District 49, 45% Democratic, 55% Republican, it's a safe seat for Republicans. House 1, 90.5, 9.5, obviously a safe seat for Democrats. Nationally, 380 of our 465 House seats, 87% are safe for either the Democrats or Republicans. In Michigan, 71% of our House districts, 78 of them, are safe. And 30 out of 38, or 79% of our Michigan Senate districts are safe. I want to be real clear that these, number one, yes, this is underneath the new maps drawn by the Redistricting Commission. And number two, this is not a problem with the Redistricting Commission. They were given a list of criteria that they would solve, and Parks and Fairness was on that list. And most people think they did a fairly good job of that. Minimizing the number of safe districts was not on the list of rules, nor would it be really feasible to greatly reduce that number with single member districts because voters are geographically sorted themselves into pockets of rural, suburban, and urban. And so the only way to really create a lot of competitive districts would be to do something like combine parts of Detroit with parts of the UP. So this was not a problem with the redistricting commission. It's just a result of where we are geographically. In those safe districts, the primaries are the elections. They pick the election winners. And need to be really clear that these safe districts are really, really safe. So in Michigan House in 2024, winning the safe district was the dominant party 100% of the time. In 2022, the Michigan Senate was 100% accurate. Nationally, Fair Vote, an organization devoted to voter reform, in 2022, which was 2 years before the 24 elections, predicted with 100% accuracy the results of 407 of the U.S. House races. They didn't know who was running. They didn't know what the issues were going to be. They didn't know anything except this was a tendency of that district to vote Democratic or Republican. So to steal a phrase from a friend, this means that in a large number of races, we're not a two-party system, but we're a one-party system. And that one party determines their winner in the primary. So let me show you what happens in a safe district. Michigan House District 3. It's a safe seat for Democrats, 75-25. In 2024, the primary had 3 candidates. The winner had 3,033 votes. Those 3,030 voters were 4% of the person's voting age, and they picked who is going to represent the 92,000 odd people in that district. Michigan House District 50, safe seat for Republicans, 64-36. 4 candidates, the winner had 47-23. That was 6% of the persons of voting age picked who is going to represent the 93,000 persons in the House district. In these districts, those winners of those voters in those primaries are telling the people, don't need to push, I'm ordering for all of you. I've got the winning candidate. So what happens when you add up the winning votes for the winners of the primaries in these safe districts? This means that in 2024, 87% of the US House was elected by 7% of Americans because they won the primary in a safe district. Michigan is not much better. In our 2024 primaries for the Michigan House, 5.6% of Michigan voters elected 71% of the Michigan House. I don't know how we can call ourselves a democracy when this few voters have this much influence over who our representation is. The next problem, partisan primaries eliminate candidates that a majority of voters want to represent them. Well, it's easy to document this because there are examples. Joe Lieberman was primaried out in 2006, but won the general election. Lisa Murkowski was primaried out in 2010, but won the general election in a write-in campaign. This last one you probably haven't heard about is Dan Newhouse. He's a Republican representative for Washington, state of Washington. And in 2024, then Newhouse voted to impeach Donald Trump. In 2024, he had a real Republican come in to primary him out. And in the primary, Dan Newhouse lost by almost 10 percentage points, 33-23, to this person who had been brought in to primary him out. But Washington has a top 2 primary format. So instead of being dropped out because it was a partisan primary in this top 2 primary, they take the 2 biggest vote getters and advance them to the general election. And in that general election, Newhouse beat the real Republican by almost 6 percentage points. The next problem, safe districts disenfranchise a large number of voters. If you remember that 71%, if you count the number of Michigan voters that are in those districts that prefer the other party from the dominant party, almost a quarter of Michigan voters are in that category. And that means that those quarter of Michigan voters have no influence over who represents them unless they try to vote strategically, which has its own issues and may not work out. But generally, they don't have it. And I like this question, which is, do we want a democracy where every vote counts, or where we just count every vote? We're counting every vote now. We're not making those votes count. Next problem, partisan primaries nominate candidates from the edges of the U.S.'s ideological spectrum. So this is a chart that comes from Pew Research that tracked voters' ideology in the U.S. as a whole from 1996 to 2023. So this red band here is conservatives, and it's 26%, except for once. This gray band is the moderates. It's 36%, plus or minus one a couple times. And the liberals are 17%, except plus or minus one. Very, very stable over the last 27 years. Well, what has happened to our representation in the U.S. Senate? And I'm picking on the U.S. Senate because redistricting doesn't affect it. Whole state and voting in it, what happened? Who were we getting? In 1982, if you looked at the number of senators who were between the most liberal Republican and the most conservative Democrat, there were 58. By 1994, it dropped to 34. 2002, it's 7. And 2012 and 13, it's 0. The middle has simply disappeared. How did the middle disappear when we, the voters, are staying the same? Well, the answer must be that the candidates we're getting have changed. I don't know what they have all the data to show how it changed, but I can show you what's happening today. Partisan primary voters are ideologically different from the United States. And this is again from Pew Research, where they look at it and they track from very conservative, moderate, somewhat liberal, the spread of our ideology. If you look at the number of liberal Democrats and very liberal Democrats, it's 60% in the primary. Over here, it's about 50% of the party as a whole, but that's only 26% of the U.S. as a whole. Republican primaries is 73%, which is pretty close to the 69% of Republicans as a whole, but that's only 37% of the United States as a whole. It's not anyplace close. This difference has consequences for the following reason. To win a general election, you need to win a primary. To win a primary, the winning strategy is to be about the middle. Because if you're up here, then you're going to lose all these voters and you're going to lose. If you're down here, you're going to lose all these voters and you again will lose. You need to be about in the middle, someplace close to it. And that's what being primary means. It means that you've been too far off the center of those primary voters to be able to collect enough to win. Well, if you look at the middle of the country here and put it into the middle of the, see where that winds up in the Democratic primary, you're a prime candidate to get primaried out. Same thing in the Republican parties. Here's the middle of the country. It's down here. You're going to be primaried out. So these primaries are eliminating people from the middle of the country. Well, let's map that across. So this is where, if you take the ideology of the country as a whole, the middle of the Democratic primaries is about here, which means they've got 20% to the left and 80% to the right. And over here, you got 18% and you got 82%. This is where the candidates were being offered. We're going to elect one or the other. This is also why part of the root cause of legislative dysfunction, because if you want to know how well the candidates elected from these two spots work together, just look at our government. I'd actually like to also go back to something that John Adams wrote in Thoughts on Government, 1776, where he said, quote, "The greatest care should be employed in constituting this representative assembly. It should be in miniature, an exact portrait of the people at large. It should think, feel, reason, and act like them." If this is where you're getting candidates, there is no way that it represents this whole sweep here. I also am very certain, though I can't prove it, that they don't think, feel, reason, or act like we would as a whole population. So, with the recap of the problems, we're electing the people that the majority of us sometimes don't want. Our legislature is dysfunctional. We're disenfranchising a large percentage of our voters. We're giving a great disproportionate weight to primary voters. We're eliminating candidates that the majority of people want, and we're nominating candidates from the ideological edges of the United States. So, to understand how these solve it, I need to explain what they are. So, here is what this is actually my ballot from last August for the primary. So it was a nonpartisan section, partisan section, Democrat, Republican. And I go in, we vote all these over here, and then we vote one of these columns. And then from each of those columns, one of these persons advances to the general election. So what would a ballot for a nonpartisan primary look like? Well, there are no party sections. There's just a list of offices. And for each office, you list all of the candidates for that office, and you also tell what their party they are, which makes it different from the nonpartisan, because I know over here Liska is a Democrat. That's why this is sometimes called an all candidates primary, to separate it from this. So what do you do as a voter? I come in and I pick who I think is the best candidate for that office. No more playing games. I just pick who I think is the best person for that office. What happens out of this is I don't advance one winner. I advance more than one winner. So California and Washington advance top two. Alaska goes with the top four. Some people from the University of Carnegie have been recommending five. And the reason is they figured that way there'd be two candidates from each of the major parties and leave room for a candidate from a third party. Interesting story about how Alaska wound up with four is that I got a chance to talk with a person who is one of the founders of the movement in Alaska to create the top four primary. And he'd started up something to put in ranked choice voting, and he wanted to put in five. Separately, a person who was the chief of staff for a former governor of Alaska had started up a separate ballot proposal to add in nonpartisan primaries. So the two of them agreed to meet in a bar, an Alaskan bar, and to go over about whether they should work together to maybe combine things. And they quickly realized they absolutely should. And they came down to the problem that the open primaries guy was saying two, like Washington, California, and the ranked choice voting person was saying five. And I says, well, 5 + 2 is 3.5. We can't advance 3.5 candidates. The other guy said, well, if you'll buy the next round of beer, I'll give you 4. And that's how they got to 4. It's also, I think, a classic demonstration of what practical people who aren't from the streams do. So what does the ballot look like in a general election? This is actually a real ballot from Alaska. Here's the top 4 primary winners, and they leave room for a write-in candidate. How do you vote on this? I want to show you something that the Alaska Secretary of State created to help explain it to people. And here as part of their voter education campaign.
Alaskans will use ranked choice voting in general elections for federal and state races. Instead of choosing just one candidate, you fill in the oval in column 1 for the candidate you would most like to win. Then vote for your second choice in column 2, and so on. Ranking other candidates does not impact your first choice, but you don't have to rank them all. For your vote to count, you should mark only one oval in each row and one oval in each column. We take the ballots and count all the first choices. If a candidate gets at least half of the votes in round 1, they win. If this doesn't happen, we continue to round 2, and the candidate with the least first choice votes is eliminated. We count the voter's next remaining candidate choice instead of their choice for the eliminated candidate, meaning they still have a say in who wins. We repeat these steps in rounds until there are only 2 candidates left. Whoever has the most votes wins. That's how ranked choice voting works. Check out our website and follow us on social media to make sure you're ready to rank it up, Alaska.
So Alaska did a terrific job of providing voter education ahead of the election, so that as a result of their stuff, they had no more spoiled ballots than they did in the previous election that was under a complete different, the plurality system. So with all this in mind, you have a general sketchy idea of how ranked choice voting and nonpartisan primaries work. How do these things solve the problems? Well, the first problem, remember, is that we have this minority winners of persons. And the answer is I've solved that. Because by definition, ranked choice voting says candidates must have a majority of the active votes to win. Now, the active votes is a key qualifier. And the reason is because if you go into multiple rounds, some of the ballots may run out of ballot markings. All the candidates are going to be. In which that ballot becomes inactive. And so something less. Now, something less than a quote real majority, end quote. It's critics usually call it a manufactured majority, will win. But let's talk about that. So in Alaska, where you only have these 4 candidates, sometimes only 3, in the 2 congressional elections where they've had to go to multiple rounds, the winning candidate actually had a majority of the votes of all ballots cast, not just of the last round. The problem comes when you have many candidates, 10 or more candidates. No one's going to rank all 10 candidates. We just don't have the time or the interest, perhaps. And as a matter of fact, New York City, which had 13 candidates in 2021, they limit it to just you only rank 5. So if your 5 are all among the losers that get eliminated, your vote ballot goes inactive. So in 2021 in New York City, they had to go 8 rounds to come up with a majority of the active votes, and they did. And at that point, where the winner was declared in the 8th round, 140,000 ballots, or about 2% of all ballots, were because they were voting for these other 11 candidates that had been eliminated. They were all inside of that. Every vote on their ballot was for one of those 11. The person say, well, that shows it's a real problem. My answer is, well, we can have a majority of 85% selected on the 8th round, or we can have 20% selected on the 1st round. I think I'd rather have the majority of as more people voting. And when I find out I've got someone that really represents an identifiable majority. And I think any system that we know of, both plurality, or at least both plurality and ranked choice voting, they all have problems when you have a large number of candidates. So with this, I don't want you to walk away thinking that ranked choice voting is perfect because it isn't. There's actually a very famous theorem that says no voting system that's trying to be democratic can be perfect, called Arrow's theorem. But I do want you to walk away thinking that ranked choice voting is better than plurality because it eliminates the spoiler effect. And that's something that might become really home to roost next year in Michigan with Duggan running as an independent for governor. The next problem, I talked about many voters disenfranchised. Well, that's solved. Remember in there, they said, well, if you vote for one of the persons that's eliminated, we'll just take your next vote and transfer it across. You still have a voice in who gets elected. So this means that persons can vote sincerely and still have a voice in who represents them. So pick your number in these districts where you have these persons where they pick their number one candidate who's going to be a loser. They're from their party, and then they can vote on the remaining candidates. Same person who told me was involved with the elections, creating the elections in Alaska. I asked him how I voted in the Senate, U.S. Senate election with Murkowski. And he said, well, first of all, Chris, he said, I want you to know I am not a Lisa Murkowski fan because I am a liberal Democrat. So I voted for my Democrat, number one. But number two, I voted for Lisa because she was a whole heck of a lot better than the other two candidates. And that's what ranked choice voting, he still had a voice in who represented him. Next problem, a small number of voters in the primary picked the great majority of the legislature. Well, it's solved because you're not picking the winner. I'm picking multiple candidates. So in some districts, like if it's that 90%, I might advance two Democrats or whatever, but I'm not picking the single winner that runs against the losing party in these safe districts anymore. So that just automatically eliminates it. The other part that's an interesting side effect is that when you have these nonpartisan primaries, voter participation tends to go up. So there's a study from Fairvote here that says it's about 6 percentage points increase is when you look at all the studies. That 6% is very interesting to me because the League of Women Voters US did a study on their presidential election. And what they found was that in states where the presidential winner is known, voter turnout is about 6% less than it is in where states where it's competitive. And I thought those two things, the bottom line message here is if people know that their vote will count, more people will show up. The participation in these primaries can actually really go very high. Washington, which is a top two primary, as I mentioned, if you look at it, this is their primary. 2020, 54.4%, 31.7% showed up for the primaries in Michigan. 2022 and 2024, you can see it. So we can solve it in two ways. Number one, you're not picking a winner. And number two, I'm having more people pick that, who those candidates are. The next problem is that partisan primaries eliminate candidates that the majority of that voters want. Well, I've solved that too. You can't just beat them in a plurality primary. You have to get them eliminated completely. So in a nonpartisan primary, that candidate has to finish below the number of candidates advancing. So top two is actually fairly effective. If you remember, Don Newhouse lost in the primary, but he was number two, so he advanced and won. Lieberman would have advanced under a top two primary because he had more votes in the primary than the Republican got in the general election. Murkowski would have advanced in a top two primary also because she had more votes in the primary than all the votes together for all Democratic senatorial candidates. Even better than a top two, though, is a top four primary. Because if a candidate has more than 25% they're going to advance to the general election. And an example of this clearly is in Michigan in 2022, 2020, Peter Meyer was elected to represent the U.S. House. He was primaried out in 2022 by a MAGA Republican and went on to lose that election. But if you have been running a top four primary, it's clear Meyer would have been in the finals and competing against the same Democratic candidate that he beat 2 years before. It's also pretty clear that, not as clear, it's not clear at all. It'd been very interesting if they had smashed them together into an all candidates primary. We had the Democrat, this MAGA Republican, and Peter Meyer running. It's not clear that Meyer wouldn't have advanced. It's not clear one way or the other. You know, some Democrats may have advanced and provided the few thousand votes that were needed to advance him to a rematch with his previous Democratic opponent. So the bottom line is that once you put this in, the partisan, the primarying out someone is greatly reduced. The next problem is that partisan primaries advance only candidates from the ideological edges of the United States. Well, I'm saying that's solved again. If you think about the candidates on the previous pages that we've advanced, Murkowski, Lieberman, Newhouse, and Meyer, they broadened the choices in the general election. And that's what we're after. And they're also all viable candidates. And that's the second part of what we're after. Legislature dysfunction will be solved. And let me explain why. Danielle Allen is a political theorist at Harvard and working on democracy renovation. And what she writes is that when you change to nonpartisan primaries, which she calls all-comer primaries, it changes things fundamentally. First change, you can't target your base. You have to instead target the broader spectrum of people from day one, not as an afterthought, but from the beginning. And the proof of that really comes down to is looking at candidates who operate under the system. East Point, for 6 years, ran ranked choice voting for their city council. And there's a wonderful documentary out on that you can find. And they have a woman there who ran for the city council under both systems. And she describes how under the old system, she would drive to the end of a block, and she would pull out the list that her party gave her, and she would visit those houses on the street. Once she was underneath ranked choice voting, she would pull up to the end of the block, and she would visit every house in the block. And she would get up to the house, she would talk to a person, she'd say, I can see I'm not your first choice, but let me talk to you about why maybe you should be your second choice. That starts a whole series of conversations that don't exist today and are really important, I think. Same story is told in Alaska in the film Majority Rules. The president of the Alaska Senate was primaried out in 2020. They switched to the new ranked choice voting top 5 primary, and she ran again in 2022, and she won. And she talked about this exact difference. Under the old one, I talked to my party supporters. Under this new one, I talked to everybody. She did win, and she's the president of the U.S. Of the Alaska Senate again. California legislator, there's a wonderful YouTube clip of a guy who ran under both systems also. The exact same story. And what he says is that what really changes is when I campaign to these folks, I'm not responsible first and foremost to the primary voters. I'm responsible to this coalition I'm trying to assemble out of everybody that's going to elect me. And that is a huge difference. Which brings me to the second part. When you change who you campaign to, you change what you campaign about. Quote here is, the shift would also change the tone and tenor of the media environment. And the proof of this is actually in the advice given to candidates. There are firms out there that advise candidates on how to run their campaigns. And the advice they give to candidates in California and Washington versus the advice they give to candidates in states like Michigan is different, because you have to target the interests of the public as a whole and not the interests and curiosities of the persons who are the primary voters. And that makes a huge difference. The final proof of this is to look at Nebraska, which has had a unicameral, nonpartisan legislature since 1934. The reason they have it is because there was a Republican progressive who back then said, if things keep going the same way, they will get worse, and eventually candidates will represent parties, not the people. I think it's a very prescient comment. So what they have on their state legislative is just a ballot. There are no party labels. Well, people say, we know who's who. That's it. An office and a list of candidates, and you vote for one. At the time of this report in 2015, a legislature that was 71% Republican had just passed, abolishing the death penalty, driver's license for dreamers, raising the gas tax to fund critical infrastructure improvements, and they also put on the ballot a proposal to raise the minimum wage, which did pass. Now, these are some things that people traditionally would say, well, that's not conservative. They had one of the conservatives who was supporting abolishing the death penalty. And what he said was, I've heard people tell me it's not conservative, but if any other government program were this costly, this ineffective, and this inaccurate, we'd have gotten rid of it a long time ago. Sounds pretty conservative to me to get rid of it. That type of thinking can happen when you focus on the issues and not the party positions. And the confirmation of that comes from the fact that the Nebraska's U.S. senators and representatives are elected on a traditional primary system. And in 2015, I can find no evidence that any of those persons in the U.S. Congress supported any one of those four proposals. They were supporting the party position instead. The report concludes that Nebraska serves as evidence that under a nonpartisan system, debates over issues prevail over partisan politics, even in a state heavily dominated by one political party. So hope you got a feeling for how these solve the problems. Let me talk about how it relates to the League's core missions of empowering voters and defending democracy. Well, they certainly empower voters in the primary. We get to pick who we think is the best candidate for an office. Ignore that party stuff. We just go in and pick who we think is best. And we collectively select who's going to appear on that general candidate list of candidates in the fall election, rather than being constrained to it. There's a Republican and there's a Democrat. We're going to pick who we think is best qualified for that office. The other thing about empowering voters is, if you think about it, those 24% of voters who are trapped in districts that are not who they are, parties that they don't support, they're going to have some voice in who represents them. And empowering those 24%, giving them some voice, will be the second largest expansion of voting rights, behind only the 19th Amendment, where women got the right to vote. We are defending democracy. I can think of no more core principle than majority rule. And we don't have it today. We need to change to it. The nonpartisan primaries also have several other important attributes. They make candidates responsible to all the voters from the get-go, instead of who votes in the primaries first and foremost. It increases the number of voters who select the candidates for the general election. It eliminates the disproportionate impact of primary voters. We keep on the ballot candidates that we want to represent us, and what makes the legislation functional, because we're not going to be just electing people from these extremes that can't work together. So what's next in Michigan? Rank Michigan, my vote, is putting together a proposal that they hope to get on the 2026 ballot that would add ranked choice voting only, not nonpartisan primaries. The LWBUS has adopted a position in 2020 on voter representation that explicitly approves ranked choice voting. Inside of Michigan, we're going to have a proposal come up to the floor at the 2025 convention to update our position on election law to clearly define the type of primaries that we support. We support open, what is open? And to support state explicitly our support for ranked choice voting for state and local elections. And if a ballot proposal is put on by Rank My Vote, the LWB MI advocacy group will look at it and make a recommendation on the board what to do. So that's my presentation. Hope you found some things that are of interest and whatever on it. If you have any questions or thoughts, please email me at cwiggins5678@outlook.com, and I'll try and answer them. I want to thank you all for taking the time to watch this. I really appreciate it.